The first one, right here, is called, I started with the wrong one, The Leadership Journey, How 4 Kids Became President. It's Simon & Schuster, 360 pages illustrated, and it's 1995. The other book that we're going to talk about today is a very personal book called An Unfinished Love Story, A Personal History of the 1960s. Also Simon & Schuster, 467 pages, also illustrated, and $35. So let's start with the kids book, really, the leadership book, made for people 8 to 12 years old. And it's an interesting thing that we were last speaking about leadership in your last book for adults, and now here we are speaking for the youth of America. It's illustrated. I want to show you what the book cover looks like on front and rear. And so there's a before and the after of your guys, right?
Exactly so.
And his wonderful illustrations by June Bates. How did that come about quickly?
Well, Simon & Schuster, that's somebody that they knew, and they showed us a couple people, and she did a very good job.
This is you at a frontispiece.
That is me talking to my father when he taught me how to keep score when I was 6 years old. Exactly. I love that drawing. Actually.
It's a wonderful drawing of you, and it's not very often you have a book that you write that you're the frontispiece.
Correct. Maybe the only time, that's for sure.
So that's kind of nice. Now, this is an adaptation of an earlier book that you did, again, a multi-leadership book on your guys. And what were the challenges of going from an adult book to one for kids 8 to 12 whom you want to reach?
Well, the main thing really was to concentrate on when my guys, as I call Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, and Lyndon Johnson, because I lived with them for so long, the main challenge was to write about them when they were young, so that young people could see them not as icons, not in monuments, not on the currency, but rather as they were beginning out in life. And that means they're going to make mistakes. The question is, can they acknowledge those mistakes? Do they have humility? They're going to develop empathy. They're going to go through tough times, and they're going to have resilience. I think the problem with a kid reading about a president is they think, how can I ever become them? They're so far removed from me. Here they can see what they were like when they were young. And more importantly, I think, learn the qualities that make for a great leader and hopefully develop those qualities in themselves.
Right. Very few are going to become president. Most of us don't. But we also become leaders in many different organizations throughout life. And that's what you're trying to do. Teach how leadership develops, that you make mistakes. People are human. So as an educator, I was thinking about this morning. As an educator, how would you advise parents, grandparents who want to give this as a gift, which would be a superb gift for a young person? How would you advise them to approach giving this to one of their 8 to 12-year-olds, because they're not used to maybe learning about people this way and the history this way, and especially because they might look at it as a school book or a textbook instead of something to really enjoy and grab onto personally?
Well, it depends on whether you're at the stage of reading with them still, which you still might be even with an 8-year-old, or whether you just want to tell them what the book is about before they get into it. And the difference, I hope, is that I believe in telling stories. I think that's what makes history come alive. And that, people argue that history is boring sometimes because you got to memorize all these dates and figures. If you care about the people themselves, you're going to want to know when they were born, when something happened to them. Something happens and that affects what happens next. So it's really a series of stories that you will see about these people, not only in public life, but in private life, how they dealt with their friends, whether they hurt somebody and whether they were able to apologize for that person, as Lincoln did, as you know.
Yes.
Whether or not they were able to grow as leaders, and whether when they came through tough times, they were able to become stronger as a result. These are things that happen to people in everyday lives. And you're right, it's not necessarily they're going to become president. They're going to become leaders of their school. Perhaps they become leaders of their newspaper, captains of their teams. And if they see what the qualities are that make for the good leader qualities are relevant whether you're in business, whether you're in private life, whether you're in school, whether you're a president of the United States, because they're emotional qualities about how you treat human beings.
Are mentors important? Do they have mentors?
Oh my God, did they have mentors? Lyndon Johnson, most of all. I mean, Lyndon Johnson had a feeling for how to find a mentor because he knew he had to learn from people. So there's a moment when he goes to college and he decides, well, who's the most powerful person in the college? Who do I need to get to know to become my mentor? Well, it's the president of the college, he thinks. So he's working on garbage patrol outside, and then he decides to do the most garbage pickup in the least amount of time to get notice. And he does so good, they promote him inside. So now he's mopping floors inside, but he chooses right next to the president's office. And then he does that so well, the president starts talking to him. Next thing you know, he's a messenger for the president. Next thing you know, he's in the office of the president. Next thing you know, he's living in the president's house. And that president became a mentor for him, the first of a whole series of mentors that he would have in his life.
Well, people, maybe kids don't know it, but they may find someone as a mentor, and they may not even know it until years later that that person has such an effect on them. Tell us about these sidebars. Here are a couple of sidebars that come in on this. And what are the use of the sidebars?
Well, what it means is if there's something that you want the young person to know that's not necessarily right in the story, but you're mentioning maybe the Republican parties or the Democratic parties, or you're mentioning something that you want context to, then the sidebar is something they can read. So that is like a school book then, but it doesn't have to interrupt the story. Otherwise, if you're telling that in the middle of the story, you're going to interrupt the story. It's right on the side for them.
It's almost like a footnote instead of in the back.
A big fat one.
That's right, a big fat one. I kind of like these two illustrations. Here is Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, as opposed to, not opposed to, but opposed to Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King, who was shot on my birthday, by the way. So those are beautiful illustrations that are also in this book. It's a wonderful conglomeration of illustrations, photographs, and other artifacts maybe that you show. It's not just one or the other.
Well, you know, your mentioning of Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson is part of a theme, which is that change takes place in America not simply from the top down, even though we're writing about 4 presidents, that it's often movements themselves that are on the ground that create the pressure that makes the presidents have to respond. So someone like Frederick Douglass, part of the anti-slavery movement, was critical in creating the public sentiment that allowed Lincoln to think about putting blacks in the army. So too, obviously, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement was essential for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, firing the conscience of the American people so that they could take that next step. So that's important, I think, for young people to understand. Even though they're reading about presidents, they didn't do it alone. They weren't all important. It depended upon the citizens themselves forming into movements that then pressured them to do the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. We talked a little bit about that, the topics that you have in this book, but very quickly again, maybe just speak a little bit about this. There are 3 main points that I found in here: ambition and the recognition of leadership, adversity and growth, and the leader and the times, how they led. Are those what you think the youth who are reading this should take away?
Well, I think ambition is the drive for success. It's just the desire to do well, right? The determination to try and do well wherever you're at. And what's interesting about ambition, which cuts across all these 3 categories, is that at some point in your life, your ambition becomes for something larger than yourself. We all start out wanting to do well for ourselves, do well in school, maybe for your parents to be proud of you. But then at some point, it's because you want to make something happen that's for your school. I mean, there's a story that George Bush's mother tells that he came home one day and he said, "Mom, I made 3 goals in soccer." And she said, "Yes, dear, but how did the team do?"
Yeah.
So that's what you have to think about. So that's part of it, ambition and drive for success. But then they all go through adversity. Everybody in life does. Hemingway once said, "Everyone is broken by life, but afterwards some are strong in the broken places." And all of these guys had very hard times they went through. Sometimes you can be broken by a hard time. Sometimes you just remain the same. But sometimes you, with wisdom and reflection, become a deeper person. And that's certainly what happened to Teddy Roosevelt when he lost his wife and mother when he was young, for Franklin Roosevelt having polio in his 30s, for Abraham Lincoln having to fight his way to even get, as you know, even get books when he was a young person.
but he went out. He was aggressive about that. Did any of them in their adulthood reflect on their young years or childhood and feel that there was something there that helped them along, perhaps, something that might have propelled them later?
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I think we can see what it is. I'm not sure, that I talked to them about what it was. I wish I could have.
Yes.
But I think, there's no question that for Lincoln, books, as you know so well, allowed him to imagine another life beyond the life that he was given to lead. His father kept taking those books away from him and thinking it was a waste of time to be reading because he should just be working on the farm. And yet he was so determined to read, loving it so much, that it was said when he got a copy of the King James Bible or Shakespeare's plays, he was so excited he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. And then what it allowed him to do was to think, I'm reading about other people in other worlds, reading about people at other times. Maybe I can have a different life than this. That's why literature is so important for people. It allows them to dream, and it allowed him to dream. So I think for him that was true. What's interesting to me about learning about all of them, they all had hobbies when they were young. I would say for Lincoln it was books in a way, and that's what mattered to him. They were his companions. For Teddy Roosevelt, it was birds, partly because he had asthma as a child, that he needed to be outdoors. And outdoors, he learned the color of birds, he learned their songs, and then he got interested in insects, and then he was dissecting the insects. His brother Elliot pled at a certain point, I need a different room for my brother. But little wonder that then conservation became his great legacy, that the outdoors and the beauty of the national parks and the Grand Canyon saving becomes him. And FDR collected stamps when he was a young boy. And it allows you to have a mastery, whatever hobby you have. I was at a middle school not long ago talking about the book, and I asked the kids how many had hobbies, and so many of them raised their hands. And I think for parents, it's really important because you master a little world. The world's so complicated for kids sometimes. If they can master a little world, it makes them feel it's their own. And in FDR's case, by mastering stamps, he would then read the encyclopedia to learn the country from which the stamp came. And then he was learning about the natural history of the country, its mountains, its regions, its rivers. And again, little wonder he becomes president at a time when having the understanding of maps and the globe in World War II is absolutely critical.
Curiosity is something one needs to have from 8 to 12-year-olds into retirement and old age. It's critical on the other end when one is older to have something to retire to that maybe starts as an 8 to 12-year-old. And you have it through your life. Maybe you can't do much with it. You're making a living. You're doing raising kids, whatever it is. But then when you can retire and have time, you need something to go into. So it's always critical, that
you're
curiosity.
so right. I was in a seminar with Erik Erikson, the great psychologist, and he taught us that somehow the best lives when you're older are lived if you've been able to combine in the growing up phase until you get older, work, love, and play in equal order. Work, hopefully you find a vocation, something that you love to do. Love being family, friends, and colleagues. But play being something exactly what we're talking about. It could be a hobby, it could be a sport, something that can sustain you that's not work or play, not work or love outside your life, and you can keep it the whole rest of your life. So that's very true.
There are numbers of different, well, first of all, I'm going to say to all of you parents and grandparents who are watching, this is a book that you might really want to pick up signed, start collecting early, but at the same time, it's something that is going to propel maybe your kids to something greater, whatever that might be. You might have them come to our YouTube channel and watch this, the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop YouTube page, and watch a little bit of this. They may learn there, and they might even have an entry to this book. They may want to know more because we can't really do justice to this book in this amount of time. There's so much in here of your four guys and the overlay that you've placed in it. We're talking about leadership. There's so many different definitions. What is your definition, elevator definition of leadership and how it might propel someone?
I guess what you're thinking about is leadership is
the characteristics,
an ability to
traits.
Inspire followers to come together for some worthy goal. I mean, I'd like to think that it has a goal that matters.
John Quincy Adams thought that way.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah.
But I think, it does. Somebody could define it as leading people in a bad direction. I like to think of the word leadership, as we think about it, means leadership inspiring followers to come together to together accomplish something that is worthy, that matters, that makes somebody's life better, that helps somebody, that does something that you can feel proud to tell somebody, I did this, I was part of this.
There are a number of questions I'd love to ask just as an historian. I'm going to ask two of them right now, real fast.
You're an historian. You can ask questions as an historian.
Well, exactly. One is history repeating or rhyming. I had James Carville in here during the Democratic National Convention.
This year?
Just some months ago.
I'm going to see him on November 2nd in Boston. There's going to be, with Al Hunt and him,
Oh.
they're going to be talking about the unfinished love story several days before the election, so it'll be a time.
I had him out there, and I interviewed him for about 20 minutes with Sidney Blumenthal, who brought him in.
Oh, yes, of course.
So Carville said that history repeats itself. Blumenthal said, like Samuel Clemens, it rhymes.
I think the difference is whether you hope that by learning about history, you don't have to repeat the problems of history, that you've learned something and you can make the country go in a different direction, but it has an echo from the past, because the problem may have arisen that's similar to the problem before, but hopefully you just don't do the same bad action twice. That's what repeating would be. I'd like to believe that the difference in rhyming is that it has a resemblance, but that because you read history and you learn from it, as some of these leaders do, they read history. I mean, as you know,
Yes.
John Hay wrote those long volumes on Lincoln, which Teddy Roosevelt read in the summer that he had the coal strike. All of those volumes he learned from Lincoln. In fact, there's a family resemblance of all my guys, because Lyndon Johnson's hero was Franklin Roosevelt. He called him my political daddy. So he learned from Franklin Roosevelt, right? Franklin Roosevelt's hero was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt's hero was Lincoln. Lincoln's, of course, was Washington. So that's our history.
There we are, yes. And there it is right there. You can see that.
So you'd like to believe that by reading about those guys, they learned something from them that enables them not to make the same mistake twice.
What about the ranking of presidents? Is it useful?
I think it's useful if it's done by historians after the fact, and they look at a series of categories in terms of how they communicated with the public, how they dealt with justice, how they dealt with economic opportunity, how they were dealing with foreign nations. I think the problem is it becomes now like everything else. Once the president gets in there, they're already worried about their rankings. And then it becomes, you can't know it for really a generation how to look at a president, because you're going to have to see the memoirs that come out, the journals that come out, and the context of the time changes. Harry Truman left, as you know, with 27% approval rating, and now is considered one of the near great presidents because we know what he did. The people at the time weren't aware of the long-ranging impact that NATO would have, or that aid to Greece and Turkey, or the Marshall Plan, or desegregating the Army. And similarly with Lyndon Johnson, I mean, his rankings have come up steadily, not because the war is forgotten, but because the domestic issues, they're part of our everyday life. Medicare, and aid to education, and civil rights, and voting rights, and immigration reform. All of it is at NPR and PBS. So that I think it matters. I think it's good for presidents to think and look at who was ranked at the top. George Washington always, and FDR always, and Abraham Lincoln always. And look at their qualities. And that would be a great, great mentor for any young leader to have, or even a president to have.
The context of their times is something I like to ask about. All of these men you mentioned came up in a time of turmoil into the presidency. How did that affect their presidency, and were they ready for that?
Well, you know, one of the things Teddy Roosevelt says is that without a great challenge, you're not going to have a great president. In fact, he made some comment that I don't agree with, which if Lincoln didn't have the war, we wouldn't know Lincoln's name today. I mean, it may be that we
Clinton worries about that, too.
Clinton worried about that, too, yes.
Yeah.
But when Teddy Roosevelt said we wouldn't know Lincoln today, we would have known him, I think, anyway, because of who he was. The people who knew him knew he was special, even if he hadn't become the president in the middle of a war. So my guess is somebody would have written about him in Illinois. It may not have been the world-class person he became, but there was something, something about his qualities that are... I remember when I started working on the book on Lincoln, I went to David Donald's house, the great historian of Lincoln, who lives in Lincoln, Massachusetts, on Lincoln Road in Lincoln,
That's right.
Massachusetts. And he said to me, "You'll never regret studying Lincoln. You'll feel like you're a better person after it's over." Because Lincoln had these ordinary human emotions we all have of envy or anger or jealousy. But somehow he knew that you've got to tamp them down, if otherwise they'll fester. And every time one of those emotions come up, I just think, Abe is there telling me, don't think that way.
Well, personally, I'm happy he became president, because if he hadn't been assassinated, frankly, there wouldn't be an Abraham Lincoln bookshop. So that's just what that is.
No,
I don't
what
think
are you
so. There's
saying? You're saying because of the drama of the assassination?
martyrdom. He was infused into culture.
I agree, but I think still, what if he had been not assassinated and that second term had been the Reconstruction term and we'd moved forward instead of backward?
I think that would have taken hold. I worry about that. I think Lincoln would have led us somewhere good, but once he was gone, I'm not sure the South wouldn't have taken over just as they
that
did.
might be. The forces were out there a rebellion forces, a backlash was going to be there. But suppose he had been able to move us further. He was going to be one of the great presidents. There'd be an Abraham Lincoln bookstore. Well, maybe not a book. I see what you're saying. We don't have a special bookstore for any of the other presidents.
Not
do
a
we?
Millard Fillmore bookshop, definitely.
Or Franklin Pierce.
Yeah, or Franklin Pierce.
Fair enough.
Political perspective, let's talk about that. You gave an example in here of Frederick Douglass with Lincoln, and we showed that. And Lincoln was slow from the abolitionist point of view, but swift, even radical to the American people. So there is a perspective that we need to take, and people do even today when we look at our politicians. And did they share a trait of being able to read the American public, how far they could go?
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the most important traits of any leader is being able to understand the sentiment. I mean, that's what Frederick Douglass said. If you regard him as an abolitionist's point of view, he's going to be slow, and you're not going to be happy with what he's doing. But if you regard him as a leader who has to deal with the public sentiment of the time, then he's radical and forward-looking. Lincoln, I think, was brilliant in reading public sentiment. I mean, he later said, if I'd issued the Emancipation Proclamation 6 months earlier, I would have lost the border states. I would have lost the war. If I waited any longer, I would have lost the morale boost it provided. So that's a really important thing that I think young people who hope to become leaders, they have to listen to the people around them. They're not just talking. They have to listen to understand what they're feeling. If you're going to move them, if you're going to move a class forward to a joint project, or if you're going to move a team forward and try and inspire the team, you have to really know what they're thinking and feeling. And then and that affects timing. I mean, he would have those people came in the mornings. Anybody could come and see him for an hour or so and tell them their stories. And after a while, Nicolay and Hay said, "Mr. President, you don't have time for these ordinary people." He said, "You're wrong. These are my public opinion baths. I must never forget the popular assemblage from which I've come." Then he went to the battlefield more than a dozen times. He wanted to talk to the soldiers, to bolster their morale, but also to listen to them. So and then he would know when it was right to introduce black soldiers into the army, because he knew when they were ready. In a democracy, Lincoln said public sentiment's more important than anything.
I'm going to ask a question that I was going to ask for the next book right now, and that's with LBJ, where you mentioned that you think he didn't go for another term because he knew he was not doing well with the war. I'm not sure that was it, or he read the votes. There was no one who could read votes like LBJ.
He knew that it was going to be tough in the primaries. There's no question. He'd almost lost the New Hampshire primary. He was going to lose in Wisconsin. But delegates were chosen in those days by the party structure more, and he had control still of the party structure. Humphrey never went in a single primary, and he still got the nomination. But that was part of it, there's no question. But part of it was that he was told that the war was going to take 200,000 more people, and it would even then only be a stalemate, and he knew it was time to wind down the war. And if he didn't wind it down, or if he was still a candidate winding it down, then nobody would believe it was authentic. So I think it was a whole combination of motives that were behind him at that time.
This is a colder look at him, because it's what I kind of felt at the time, that especially when I heard the tapes, that he didn't want to be the first president to lose a war. And is that perhaps why he just would not get out? There was a gift given to him. I saw it in the National Archives, where they showed gifts given to various presidents. And in the LBJ one, there was a shovel, near, you could buy from Sears Roebuck.
Yeah.
And the letter that came with it was a gift to him, said, you won't prosecute the war, you won't get out of the war. Here's a shovel to bury last week's dead.
Wow. Well, no, there's no question that the fear of failure was what motivated him from the time he started the war. When he came in, he was told, unless you produce more people to go into the war right now, we're going to lose it, and you'll be the first president to lose a war. So he kept putting more people in, hoping that there'd be a vision that somehow success could come. Nothing can be won with a fear of failure as the starting point. Just the opposite was true with him for domestic legislation. He had a vision of the future from the start. He knew what he wanted, and he could move people toward it. But yes, I think that's true. But on the other hand, you have to look at all of these presidents in terms of some of their accomplishments and their failures. They're all going to disappoint us, or they're all in the context of the times. And this is important for young people to understand, too, because we're in a time now where we look back at people and we're saying, oh, we shouldn't call a school the Lincoln School anymore because he was involved with colonization, or he didn't think blacks should serve on juries, or we have to undo George Washington because he had slaves. We have to be able to understand what the context was. You wish they were different, as we have values now that are different, but people 200 years from now may wonder why we did some of the things we did.
Exactly it.
Right?
Exactly it.
And that's what you want young people to understand, not to look at them, judging them by our standards today, but that's why they have to read the history to see what they were up against at the time.
And you'll get that history from this book. And it's well worth starting them out young, and they'll have a signed copy to put on their shelves and begin collecting. And by the way, it's been 19 years since Team of Rivals came out. And we have some copies of this that you have signed for us. Thank you. And this is a book, they may not even know you yet if they're 8 to 12, let alone Team of Rivals. But if you want to buy something with this other book, this might be it. Because after they're 12, they're going to begin to read a book just like this and take you further into our guy, Abraham Lincoln. So we have signed copies of this as well. I think it's a perfect pairing with this other book and bring Doris Kearns Goodwin to a new generation who deserve to know. I'm going to ask you two questions really fast.
Yes, sir.
One is service. Did each of them feel that they wanted to serve the nation?
I think as they grew into the office more, they did feel that way. Whether they started that way or not, I don't know. But I think that's the goal, that what you want in a leader who's going to be remembered over time is that they're serving not themselves alone, but the nation. Yes.
Well, I think that we've talked about the service and about historical perspective and what you want young people to get from this book. So I'm going to now move on to another book that is called An Unfinished Love Story. This is what I told you about half an hour ago. And this is a little more personal. It's certainly what became personal to me, because we're very close to the same age. Dick was a bit above us, but nonetheless, he was involved in things I was involved with as well. I understand his reluctance to want to maybe get into all of this, because I was at the convention in 68. I was.
Oh my God.
We
could have met each other.
We could have met each other. I was really in McCarthy's headquarters in the Hilton.
Wow.
And so was Dick.
Well, so was Dick, yeah.
And then I worked in fundraising for McCarthy for a good long time. Then also two men that were involved in this book, Al Lowenstein and Kenneth Galbraith. I had each of them to one of my fundraisers. Wow. Galbraith, I had at Playboy Mansion. Hefner wanted to do it, and the McCarthy people kept saying, no, what will the delegates from Iowa think? I said, they love it, they'll come. And 2 weeks before the convention, they needed money, so they had me do that.
Oh, my God.
And then even Dick, I remember not being happy with him when he left Clean for Gene and went back to Bobby when he came back in.
It wasn't that he was unhappy with McCarthy.
Oh, no, I know, but he was a Kennedy guy. I understood it, but we were still...
Oh, no, I understand that. The kids must have felt, because he loved the kids.
We were really ticked off about that,
Really
I got to admit.
No, he was too. I mean, he had told McCarthy when he entered that if Bobby entered the race, this was his closest friend and he'd have to leave.
Yeah.
But he felt terrible leaving the kids, and he knew they'd feel it was a betrayal because they had loved listening to his stories. They'd stay up late at night,
Wow.
and he'd be telling these wild stories about, not wild, but stories about the days in the White House, and they loved listening to me. It was like, the old bard that came along and talked. But McCarthy himself understood. McCarthy said Dick was like a pitcher. You could trade him to another team, and he'd make his first start brilliantly, but he'd never relay the secrets of the previous team, that you could trust him.
In this unfinished love story, which is fabulous, you're going to just get into a decade of two people that were there who made a difference, and their voices are heard now from a historical point of view. And did you find it difficult to be the subject of a book and the historian of yourself?
Well, what was difficult at first was just going through these 300 boxes that Dick had saved over all these years. And I'd seen them earlier, and I just wanted him to open them for so many years because I knew what they contained. He was everywhere. He was with Kennedy, he was with Johnson, he was with McCarthy, he was with Bobby, he was with Jackie. And he was just so sad about the way the decade had ended that he didn't want to look backward. He wanted to go forward. Martin Luther King dead, Bobby Kennedy dead, the riots in the streets and the campus violence. But finally we made this pact that we would do it together on the weekends because he turned 80 and he decided if I have any wisdom, this is how he talked, if I have any wisdom to dispense, I better start dispensing now. So
Wow.
It was a great adventure that we had together. It was different from my other guys because I was in presidential archives. This was an archive, it's a really substantial archive, but the guy's alive rather than dead. And I could ask him questions and I could talk to him. I used to talk to all my other people, but they never answered me. But now there he was answering me.
Well, here is from the book two images that are next to each other, wedding, and then later in life in 2015. And if you want to put this on here, Bjorn, real fast, you'll see them together. And so you started a debate with him. If you can get over here. You started a debate with Dick early on when you first met about the nature of your presidents that you were both with. Of course, you shared LBJ at different times. Did the debates, when you opened this archive, change at all?
No, what
over
really
perspective
happened,
time?
what really happened that mattered so much in the opening, more than anything in the opening of the boxes, was that when we started, Dick still held some grievances against LBJ, even though his greatest public service was with LBJ and working on the Great Society, and working on that great We Shall Overcome speech, and really being a part of that domestic accomplishments in 1964 and 65. After the war, he had just turned against LBJ, and LBJ had turned against him, and he had a lot of sadness left in him that he felt the war had taken away all the things that really mattered. And there was an anger that was left toward LBJ. And I still felt enormous loyalty to LBJ. It was my experience as a White House fellow that had led me to becoming a presidential historian, working for LBJ in Washington, and then accompanying him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs. So we argued about it. I would say LBJ got through all the programs that JFK tried to get through, and he'd say, yeah, but maybe we wouldn't have stayed in the war in Vietnam as long. And it wasn't fun, the arguments. They sound it now. But when he started going through the boxes of 64 and 65, especially reliving those extraordinary weeks and months of the Great Society, when every few days, it seemed, a new law was coming out that everybody believed in at the time. That's the important thing. This was a time when people, both sides of the aisle, felt these laws were making the country better. And when he remembered all of that, he started, one night we went to bed and he said, oh my God, I'm feeling affection for the old LBJ guy again. And it meant that he'd put away those grievances. And in that last year of his life, when he got cancer and we were still going through the boxes, he just felt a sense, as long as I have boxes to go through, then I'll still live on. Who's going to finish first, the boxes or me? But it gave him a sense of purpose, and it gave him a sense of serenity in the end, so that I'm really grateful that we were able to do this.
It's going to be interesting. We may not be here if LBJ is going to be Trumanized in the future,
Right.
because while some of us are still alive, we still have a lot of anger at LBJ because he could have been one of the great presidents then, now. If he hadn't lifted up his shirt and showed the scar that was Vietnam. Remember that cartoon?
I do.
And that's what happened. And he was on such a great run, and then that did not
It's a
help.
tragedy for him as well as for the country, but I think what we have to look at, and I think in time, that's what you are saying, I think we will be seeing the enormous domestic accomplishments. I mean, think
I
about
think so too.
ending segregation in the South. I mean, for such a long period, 78 years of Jim Crow, blacks couldn't go into department stores, they couldn't go into restaurants, they couldn't go into sporting events. Overnight, that gets changed. And what impact voting rights has had in terms of mayors and governors and president, finally, but more importantly, giving power to the black community.
Well, we civilians, for heaven's sakes, that grew up with Strom Thurmond
Right.
in the 50s, for heaven's sakes, we never thought we'd have a Southern president come in and do what he did.
Right.
And that was amazing. I want to show this right here. Can you see this book, this image? Here you are as a fellow with LBJ. So, two things. One, now we can see what, besides your intellect, just what attracted LBJ to you. That's one. The second thing, and I'm not the only one to be saying that, by the way. I've heard it elsewhere. The second thing is that, what is it like to have a president open for you?
I don't know what I'm doing there, to be honest.
You were going to give a talk right
I
after
was
that.
going to give a talk, yeah, but I must be talking to a friend of mine who's in the press there, because I'm sort of, I'm glamming up for him.
Yeah,
I mean, it's got
yeah.
nothing to do with what's going on. Somebody
No.
must have said something to me out there, and I'm doing this, and I'm wearing that, fringe dress. But that was the custom of the time.
Yeah, exactly it. Dick had, as we were saying, worked for a number of presidents and presidential wannabes like McCarthy. He wrote speeches for all of them. Did he have to change his wording, his approach for each one? I don't think you could write the same speech for John Kennedy that you could for LBJ.
Absolutely not. No, the cadences had to be different. I mean, he knew that right from the start. He realized that, John Kennedy spoke relatively fast. He liked those clipped sentences. Johnson spoke much more slowly. And more importantly, he thought that Johnson needed a more conversational style like FDR rather than John Kennedy. But mostly important, even more than that, and McCarthy had a different style of speech, Bobby Kennedy different. But the important thing is for a speech to work, it's not so much the words only that are written. It has to come with a conviction of the person who's speaking it. Dick said what convinces is conviction. And it has to be on time, it has to be timely, the speech, to really matter. As the We Shall Overcome did, the speech after Selma. It helped to produce the Voting Rights Act. That's what matters for words, if they help to produce action. He said, like, if Patrick Henry came into the Chamber of Commerce today and starts yelling, "Give me revolution" or "Give me death," it would be absurd.
Yeah.
It had to be at the time of the revolution, where he was and where he was standing when it was happening.
There are numbers of questions I'd like to ask. I'm not sure we have time to go into all of these. But one great story, and maybe really make it brief, but it's interesting because you let out your inner self here as the son of a psychoanalyst. I like that. You wrote an article in the New Republic. Now, Dick certainly coined the phrase the Great Society. And you, when you came in, were kind of put in a position to make that happen. You were one of those there. So the Great Society and the courage that it took to do that, did Dick see that going in? Did he where did he put together the Great Society coinage?
No, it's actually one of the great stories. That the stories are what history is, right? So what happened is, in March of '64, Dick had gone over to work for LBJ. And a couple of weeks later, Bill Moyers came to him and said, the president wants to talk to us about his agenda for the future. They got the tax cut bill was gone through, civil rights was about to go through, and he wanted the Johnson agenda. So Dick said, are we meeting in the Oval Office? He said, no, we're going to the White House pool. So they go to the White House pool, and Johnson is there swimming naked in the pool, like a whale, going up and down, side stroking. So Dick and Moyers are standing on the side in their suits and their ties. And Johnson said, well, come on in, guys. We have a lot to talk about. So they had to strip, too. So now you have 3 naked guys swimming in the pool. The Great Society is going to be born here. I'm not making a tangent here.
Yes.
And so then Johnson starts pulling them over to the side, and they talk about what it is that he wants to accomplish. And he had known really from the first day what he wanted. He knew he wanted Medicare. He knew he wanted civil rights and voting rights. He knew he wanted immigration reform. He knew he wanted something with the arts. And anyway, they decided they'd give a speech. A speech can often serve as a deadline for coming up with the programs. So they made a promise to have a speech at the University of Michigan, same place where the Peace Corps was born, on May 22nd. And then Dick was responsible for getting everything together. You know, people would come in with suggestions, and task forces were in the making. And finally, they had to get a name for this thing then. And so some people started suggesting all different names. Somebody suggested a better deal rather than a new deal, or the Glorious Society. But Dick finally decided, I'll try out a few things in the newspaper in a speech, and he got one was the Great Society, and people sort of caught on. Then another one, but it was just not even in capital letters then, the Great Society. And then finally, that's what it became. So as I often tease, the Great Society was born with 3 naked guys in a pool.
Better than in front of an open bathroom door.
That is correct. The pool is fine.
Yeah, the pool is fine. Because we're the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, I was reading about Jackie in here, and Dick with that in the Manchester book. It's an interesting story. You're going to have to read about it to get to know it. But I wonder, is there any comparison you might make between Jackie Kennedy and Mary Lincoln after their husbands were assassinated in front of them?
I mean, all that one can imagine is what an enduringly terrible pain it would have been for both women. I mean, not only to lose the man that you loved and that you had a complicated relationship, but nonetheless you were partners with, but to have been there and seen it happen at the time.
Jackie dealt with it a bit better?
Well, Jackie had a hard time in those first years. I mean, she went and lived in different parts. She wrote a beautiful handwritten letter to Dick explaining
It's in the book.
that she was not sure that she could go back and live in New York or Washington. So she was trying out Brazil. She tried out Argentina. Then she went to Hawaii and thought, maybe I can live here. A lot of people have found peace here. But she wasn't sure she could do that either. So it took her a while to come back. But finally, she did establish a private life for herself. But remember, though, she had the 2 kids that she had to take care of, who she did love, and they had a good family relationship. And Mary had also lost Willie earlier. She lost Tad, you know, and so she was much more lonely. I mean, Robert was there, but not to be on a daily basis with her the way the kids were with Jackie.
Talking about Robert, I wondered about this as well. When you were writing Team of Rivals and with Dick there, you know, after you finally, I mentioned this once some time ago, that it was a good thing that Dick was there after you stopped getting up in the morning with these 4 guys. So it was good that The Rock was there.
He was the main guy.
Yeah. And so Robert lived through 2 presidents that he knew who got shot. And Dick the same way. Did he ever talk about Robert or make some comparison, even just a comparison between him and Robert Lincoln?
Wow. Dick was a huge Lincoln scholar. He loved Lincoln. He had read as much as I had about Lincoln before I started on this. I don't think we ever talked about that, but that's really interesting. I mean, he himself had lived through, I mean, he was with Bobby when he died.
Yeah.
So that those 2 assassinations, and they also changed his life, as they did many people's lives. But he was supposed to be appointed on the night of November 22nd, 1963, a new special consultant on the arts. And he was so excited about that because he wanted to bring arts and literature to the rural areas, to places where they weren't, to poverty areas. He was going to make the arts for Kennedy what conservation was for Teddy Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that job was undone, as well as so much else for the country when John Kennedy was killed. And then had Bobby lived, he would have been right in the center of it all with him. I mean, this was his closest friend, and they were really, they worked very well together.
Yeah. It was obvious that we could see that. I did find a smoking gun of an illegal action, though, in the book, and that is that Dick and Bill Moyers were smoking Cuban cigars. So I'm just saying that.
No, I will acknowledge that it was so. So was John Kennedy. In
Positively.
fact, at a certain point when Dick came back from a conference in Punta del Este with Che Guevara Truman, Castro's right-hand man, had
Yes.
given him a box to give to Kennedy,
Mm.
and Kennedy took it out immediately and then gave us the box. He gave Dick the box, and then we got the box eventually, but it's a beautiful box with an inlaid Cuban seal.
Oh, very nice.
But the
You still
cigars
have
were
that?
taken by, well, no, they're all at the University of Texas at the Briscoe Center down
Okay.
there. All Dick's papers and my papers went there. So we just came back from an exhibit there, which was incredible. It was so beautiful. They had a lot of the manuscripts of the first drafts of a lot of the speeches there. The cigar box is there. Mementos from the '60 campaign are there. And then they've got big pictures on the walls. It was really exciting. It felt like we were reliving that period of time.
I'm going to ask you about, as an historian again, I have this question. Michelle Crowell of the
Oh, I know her very well.
of the
She was-
Library of Congress.
Yes.
And she and I are having an ongoing conversation.
Is
as
that
to-
a euphemism for an argument?
No, what, but that'll be the next one. I'll see her in the forum and I'll ask her. But about an artifact. What is an artifact? And she and I differ a little bit on that. The Oxford English Dictionary defines an artifact as a thing made of art, an artificial product, and defines art as skill on doing anything as a result of knowledge and practice. So I believe that manuscripts, letters, are artifacts. Shall know those are a separate thing entirely. So would you say that the whole collection, that the archive, is itself an artifact, or even the individual pieces in there? I'm not sure you've really
No,
thought about this, but here you are.
I do think, like, for example, the telegram that Martin Luther King sent to President Johnson after the speech at Howard University, which was the formation of affirmative action. And Dick had that in his files, and I held that. It's an actual telegram, and it said in it, "This is the most profound speech ever given by any president of the United States." I think that's an artifact. I mean, there was an emotion I felt when I was holding that, or I hold the first draft of the We Shall Overcome speech, or the Great Society speech, or Bobby's Ripples of Hope speech that he gave in Cape Town. Yeah, I think those are artifacts. I mean, that's a very interesting question.
The artifact area of our culture is beginning to accept letters as artifacts.
Yeah.
So Michelle, it's up to you now. You're in. You're up.
And Michelle she was my research assistant for Lincoln. I mean, I think the world of Michelle. So I will have this conversation with her as well.
Okay, well, we'll have to have that. I want to ask you about, again, as an historian, I asked this of both Blumenthal and Carville when they were here. Conventions. Have we lost something because of the smoke-filled rooms? The primaries are certainly more democratic, and we're not going to go back, I suppose. But we don't have I liked when a convention came out with, this person represents us and our platform. The primary system can be just a beauty pageant, and we can get people like someone I don't really want to mention that the party would not have had as their standard bearer, and we still would have had two good parties.
No, the really interesting thing is that the first primaries occurred in 1912, in part because Teddy Roosevelt wanted to run again, and he was going to run against his friend Taft, and he knew that Taft was the sitting president who had the delegates that were part of the party. So he decided that we needed primaries where democracy should rule, and they became very contentious, the primaries between Teddy and Taft. The New York Times wrote an editorial saying, if this is the first example of the primary system, we sincerely hope it's the last. Everyone should blush at what this became, the anger in which it became. This is not a rational system. This is a mob. Go back to the convention system. I think there's something to what you say, that the conventions chose at least their perception of who could reach the country as a whole, who would be the best person for that. In fact, that's interesting. I mean, there are artifacts in Dick's papers also that from these conventions. I love seeing those artifacts. And, I hope sometime you can get down to Austin, because you, as a person who loves these things, the exhibit is called History and Fate, and it's up there until July 25th at the Briscoe Center. It's there now.
Yes,
it's up there until July. Yeah, it'll be there for a while. So you'll get down to Texas.
I'll get Gary Gallagher and I.
For anybody
will
who
go down.
loves the art, you'll see the speeches, you'll see the newspapers, you'll see it all. It's all there, and it's in beautiful cases. They've done a great job.
I'm going to go down and see it. It's something that draws me there, actually. I don't know if you could say anything about this, but I'm going to ask anyway. You can just give a topic, nothing inside. Is there any topic that you decided not to put into this book that came out of the archives, that you decided, no, we're going to, not like Robert Lincoln burn his parents' papers, but nonetheless. Is there anything you decided to not put in?
Not really. I mean,
except maybe for Jackie. I know there was, that's too personal perhaps for her.
No, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I think it was a question of how much emphasis to give to one thing versus another. But, and there were things that, obviously there were other parts of Dick's life that mattered that didn't, impinge on what was happening publicly, because this was not just our private lives, but our public lives as well. So, for example, one of the most important things that was happening during all these years was my bringing up the kids. It wasn't at the time I was writing this book, but, and that was hard to not decide to put a lot in about the kids. And I mentioned things earlier, but then you start thinking, people are going to wonder, is that all they're talking about is the past? But it didn't fit, because the time in which we were going through the boxes, they were out of college. They weren't in the house anymore. If they'd been there all the time, we would have been talking about them all the time. But I missed not telling enough stories about what they meant in my life, because they were the center of it as well.
Right, and put it up on your website.
That is true.
do a supplement that way.
Yeah.
Certainly, there's so much more in this book. We don't have the time to go into this one, but maybe just give a skeletal view of what happened with that New Republic article, because both you and Dick took down a president.
Well, I don't know about that.
I'm just
but anyway, I did not,
saying
certainly.
how we felt.
And I don't even think Dick felt that way. All that really happened with the New Republic article,
and it almost harmed your fellowship.
Well, this is what's so well said about Lyndon Johnson. What happened is I was chosen as a White House fellow. We had a dance at the White House. He did dance with me. He also danced with the other two women. There were only 3 of us out of the 16 White House fellows. But he said he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House. But then this article that a friend of mine and I had written a draft of and sent to the New Republic against Lyndon Johnson, against the war. We like so many young people, against the war. Suddenly appeared in the New Republic. We had not heard it was going to be published until after this choice of the White House Fellowship. And they put the title on How to Remove Lyndon Johnson in 1968. So that could have not only lost me the fellowship, but I was worried that it would hurt the fellowship as a whole. But Johnson said to everybody, just bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. Yeah. So that was pretty extraordinary.
And at first, he didn't bring you into the presidency the way
they would have been afraid
to
have me go. So I went to the Labor Department first, and then once he pulled out of the race, I came over.
Yeah, and helped.
And it's made me a presidential historian. I'll be forever grateful to him. I mean, those conversations with him, both in the White House staff and then going down to the ranch to help him on his memoirs, are what produced my first book. And then that's what gave me the chance to have a second book and a third book. And before you know it, 50 years have gone by, and I've been studying these presidents my whole life.
Okay, you've won another point on the ledger for me for LBJ. He produced you. And that's a terrific thing. So this is not enough time, but we have these three books for you, and get this for your kids or grandkids. They're going to like this, and they'll grow into it. You can read it. You can look at the images and the pictures as well, and they'll take something out of this, because this is the age that they are. And so there's worthwhile for this holiday season to get. And if you pair it up, as I said, have Doris in our lives again with Team of Rivals. Youngsters don't know this book. They will go right into it after the youth leadership book. So I really recommend that one as well. And you'll start them with a shelf of signed books that they can enjoy and collect and maybe get the fever as well. And then this was a really fun book, not only because I lived it myself when I was there, but so many interesting stories and asides that we did not know as we were going through the 60s. So the only thing you could have done was put in a memory stick with all the music of the day, so we could have
I would love to have done that.
listened to that as this
Exactly.
went by. So another book that I think you would all like, we have signed editions of it right now, and so take advantage while we still do, and have had Doris here. Thank you so much
I'm glad
for
to
being
see you
here.
again. I'm glad to be
It's
able to do
terrific,
this with
and
you.
I know you love writing.
Lots
so
of years gone by, right?
Yeah, you're telling me
2005,
since team.
yeah.
When that's when you first were on the show.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
you were here years before, getting books for Team of Rivals.
That's right. That's right. We were here. This is where I got many of my books from. I came here
right.
to build up my library from you.
So thank you again for joining us on A House Divided with Doris Kearns Goodwin. I hope you'll join us again when we have our next one. Watch our website for what's coming up next. Thank you and peace.
Bye, everybody.